The rain had been following Hank Morse since Barstow. It started as a gray suggestion somewhere south of Death Valley, just a bruising of the horizon, that a man on a motorcycle watches the way he watches everything on a long ride with attention and without alarm. By the time he crossed into Nevada on Highway 95, it had become something with intentions a hard-driving curtain of desert rain that turned the asphalt black and made the yellow lane markers disappear and reappear like something uncertain about whether it wanted to be seen. He pulled his collar up and leaned into the wind and rode through it because there was nothing else to do, and because stopping had never been something that came naturally to him. Hank Gravel Morse had been riding since he was 19 years old. He was 45 now, and in the 26 years between those 2 points, he had put more miles on, more motorcycles across more states than he had ever bothered to count, because counting was the kind of thing that turned a life into an accounting exercise, and Hank had never had much patience for accounting. What he had patience for was the road. The long, empty American road with its particular quality of silence that was not really silence at all, but the specific sound of distance of asphalt, an engine and wind, and the absence of everything that was not those 3 things. He was a large man, 6 feet 3 inches, built in the way that men who have spent years doing physical work are built, with a density to the frame that came not from a gym, but from decades of lifting and hauling and riding and the occasional necessity of handling situations that required a certain amount of physical presence to resolve. His beard had gone mostly gray in the last 2 years. Not gradually, but in the sudden way that grief sometimes accelerates things that were going to happen anyway. His hands on the handlebars were scarred across the knuckles, in the way of a man who had been young and angry once, and had learned slowly and at some cost how to redirect that energy into things that lasted longer than a fight. The patches on the back of his leather vest told most of his story to anyone who knew how to read them. Hell's Angels Motorcycle Club, Nomad Chapter, Road Captain, 11 years of full membership, 2 service pins from the club's veteran outreach program, which Hank ran out of a rented space in Barstow twice a month, and had run for 6 years without telling anyone outside the chapter that he was the one who paid the utility bills out of his own pocket every winter. He had been an Army Ranger for 8 years before all of that. 2 deployments to Iraq, 1 to Afghanistan, a 3rd to a place that did not appear on the official paperwork and that he did not discuss. He had come home from the last deployment in 2009 with his body intact and his sleep broken in the way that combat does to a person, and he had found that the only thing that helped with the broken sleep was the road, and that the road was better with brothers beside him, and that brothers who understood the weight of what he carried were more likely to be found in a motorcycle club than in most other places the civilian world had offered him. Deke Pruitt had been one of those brothers. Deke Socket Pruitt, 41 years old, dead on Interstate 80 near Winnemucca, Nevada. 10 days ago, at 4:30 in the morning, in what the Nevada Highway Patrol had officially classified as a single vehicle accident involving road debris. The official report said Deke had lost control of his motorcycle at highway speed and gone into the median barrier, and that the impact had been unsurvivable, and that there were no other vehicles involved and no witnesses and no reason to believe the incident was anything other than a tragic accident on a dark stretch of highway in the early hours of a November morning. Hank had read the report twice. Then he had put it down and looked at the wall of his shop in Barstow for a long time. Deke Pruitt was the best rider in the Hells Angels chapter. He had been riding since he was 16, and he had forgotten more about motorcycle dynamics than most people ever learned in the first place. He rode that stretch of I-80 4 times a year in every season and in every weather condition. And he rode it the way he did everything, which was with complete competence and complete attention. The idea that Deke had lost control of his bike on a dry November morning on a straight stretch of highway because of road debris was the kind of explanation that sat in the mind like a stone that does not belong in the soil, too smooth, too convenient, too comfortable for a story that should have had edges. Hank was not the kind of man who reached for conspiracy in ordinary circumstances. He had seen enough actual chaos in his life to know that bad things happened for small and stupid reasons more often than for dramatic ones. Accidents happened. Good men died badly, and without meaning all the time, and the desire to find a larger explanation was often just grief looking for somewhere to put itself. But something in the official report bothered him. Not a fact exactly. A quality. The way the language was arranged. The way certain details were present and other details were absent. The way the incident had been classified and closed in 48 hours. He had not said any of this out loud to anyone in the chapter. He had packed his bag and gotten on his bike and pointed north toward Reno, where the Hells Angels chapter had been holding its annual November memorial ride for 11 years, and where Deke Pruitt was going to be the name they rode for this time. He had been riding for 9 hours when he saw the sign for the Desert Hawk Diner. The sign was not much to look at. A yellow arrow on a post beside the highway with the name painted in letters that had been fading for longer than the sign had any business still standing. The diner itself was another quarter-mile off the highway on a 2-lane access road. A low, rectangular building with plate glass windows that glowed orange against the rain and a neon sign above the entrance that buzzed and flickered and turned the wet parking lot into something that looked painted rather than real. Hank pulled in at 11:22 at night. He sat on his bike in the parking lot for a moment with the engine idling, feeling the rain on his shoulders and looking through the plate glass at the interior of the diner. A tired trucker at the counter with his chin nearly touching his chest. 2 young people in a booth near the window who looked like college students who had made a wrong turn somewhere and ended up on Highway 50 without entirely meaning to. A waitress behind the counter wiping down the coffee machine with the patient efficiency of a woman who had been doing this for longer than she wanted to count. He killed the engine and went inside. The smell hit him first. Burnt coffee and fry oil and something sweet that might have been pie warming in an oven. The particular smell of a roadside diner in the middle of nowhere at midnight, which was a smell Hank associated with the American loneliness that was not unpleasant, that had a kind of honesty to it that fancier places lacked. He took the corner booth in the back to the wall. It was a habit he had carried home from places where sitting with your back exposed was the kind of mistake you only made once, and he had long since stopped thinking of it as a habit and simply thought of it as the correct way to sit in any room. The waitress came over. Her name tag said Dot. She was a compact woman in her late 50s with hair the color of iron filings and the expression of someone who had heard most things and been surprised by very few of them. She poured coffee without being asked, which told him she had been at this long enough to know that a man who came in from the rain at midnight on a motorcycle was not there for the menu. He thanked her She nodded and went back behind the counter. He wrapped both hands around the mug and looked out of the window at the rain and at the dark highway beyond the access road and thought about Deke Pruitt. He thought about the last time he had seen Deke 3 weeks ago at the chapter meeting in Barstow. Deke sitting across the table from him, arguing about the best route through the Sierras in November, Deke being wrong about it the way Deke was occasionally wrong about geography, but never wrong about the things that mattered. And Hank telling him he was wrong. And Deke telling him to mind his own business, and both of them laughing about it afterward in the parking lot while the other members went home. 3 weeks ago, now he was riding north in the rain to sit in a room full of men who had loved the same person and to remember him in the way that motorcycle clubs remember their dead, which was loudly and with engines and without excessive sentiment, because excessive sentiment was a luxury that men who had made a habit of dangerous living tended to find uncomfortable. The diner door opened. Hank did not look up immediately. The sound of the rain got louder for a moment, and then quieter as the door swung shut, and he registered the sound the way he registered everything peripherally without committing his full attention until something told him it was necessary. Then something told him it was necessary. She was small, 5 feet tall at the most, and thin in the way of elderly women who have lost weight without intending to. And she was soaking wet from the rain, her white hair plastered flat to her head, and her wool coat darkened to charcoal with the water that had come through it. She was clutching the collar of the coat closed at her throat with one hand, and she was standing just inside the doorway, and she was not looking at the menu board above the counter, or at the waitress, or at any of the things a person normally looks at when they walk into a diner. She was looking at the room. She looked at the windows first, then the parking lot beyond them, then the booths near the entrance, then the counter, then across the full length of the diner to the corner where Hank sat alone with his coffee and his Hell's Angels patches and his 6'3" frame that most people in most rooms tended to notice and then decide to give a wide berth to. Hank watched her make that calculation, watched her look at him and decide something, and then watched her begin walking toward him through the empty diner, past the counter, past the booths, past Dot, who had opened her mouth to say something, and then closed it again when she saw the direction the old woman was headed. She walked the way someone walks when they are not entirely sure their legs will continue cooperating, but they have committed to the destination and are not going to let that uncertainty slow them down. Her steps were uneven, but they were determined, and she gripped the back of a booth as she passed it, steadying herself, and then she was at his table and she was gripping the edge of it with both hands, and she was looking at him with eyes that were very dark and very clear and very afraid. Up close, he could see that she was trembling, not from the cold, or not only from the cold. The trembling had a different quality to it, the kind that comes from adrenaline that has been running too long and is beginning to exhaust the body that is producing it. She leaned forward, closing the distance between her face and his, and she spoke in a voice that was barely louder than the rain outside. "Please pretend you are my grandson." Hank looked at her. For a moment he processed the sentence, turned it over, considered the possibility that he had misheard it. Then he looked at her face again, and he knew he had not misheard anything. He said, "What?" Before she could answer, headlights swept across the front windows. The old woman's body went rigid. She gripped the table edge harder, and her head turned toward the glass. And Hank turned with her and saw what she was seeing, a black SUV late model, dark windows rolling into the parking lot at the kind of deliberate, measured speed that is not the speed of someone who happened to stop for coffee. It came to a stop 30 feet from the door with its engine running and its headlights aimed at the entrance of the diner. She grabbed his arm. He could feel the strength of the grip through his sleeve. Small hands, but holding on as if releasing her grip would mean something irreversible. "He is here," she said. "Please, just for a minute." The diner door opened. The man who stepped inside was everything the woman was not. Tall, composed, dry, despite the rain outside, as if the weather had decided it could not touch him. He wore a gray suit that fit him with the precision of something expensive, and a tie that was still neatly knotted at 11:30 at night on a Wednesday in the Nevada desert. His hair was dark with silver at the temples, and was combed back from his face with the kind of discipline that suggested he had not allowed it to do anything else in a long time. His glasses were thin wire frames that caught the fluorescent light above the counter. He was 52 years old or thereabouts, and he had the face of a man who was accustomed to being the smartest person in whatever room he entered, and who had decided some time ago that this was simply a fact about himself that required no further reflection. He stood in the doorway and he looked at the room. He did not look at it the way the old woman had looked at it when she came in. She had been searching for something. He was cataloging. His gaze moved from the trucker to the college kids, to the waitress behind the counter, to the booths along the wall. Methodical and unhurried, with the calm efficiency of a man who does this kind of assessment automatically and has done it for so long that it no longer registers to him as a choice. Then his eyes reached the corner booth. They stopped. Hank felt the old woman's grip tighten on his arm. In the 6 seconds between the man's eyes finding them and the man beginning to walk toward them, Hank made a decision. He was not a man who made decisions slowly when decisions needed to be made quickly. 8 years in the Army and 11 in the Hells Angels had taught him that the most expensive thing in a dangerous situation was hesitation, and that a decision made fast and committed to completely was almost always better than a decision made carefully and arrived at too late. He slid over in the booth. He patted the seat beside him. He said in a voice pitched to carry clearly to every corner of the small diner, "Grandma, I told you not to go out in this weather." The old woman did not hesitate either. She let go of the table edge and sat down beside him and put her arm through his with the ease of someone who had been doing it their entire life. And she said quietly and without a tremor, "Sorry, sweetheart." Across the diner, the man in the gray suit stopped walking. His expression did not change. That was the thing Hank noted most carefully. A normal person confronted with the unexpected presence of a stranger, sitting with the elderly woman they had come looking for, would have shown something on their face. Surprise. Confusion. The automatic recalibration of social expectation that shows up in the eyes or the jaw or the corners of the mouth. This man showed nothing. He stood where he had stopped, and he looked at the booth, and he did the same kind of calculation that Hank had watched him do when he first came through the door. Only this time he was calculating the new variable that Hank represented, and he did it quickly and thoroughly and with no visible emotion. Then he continued walking. He stopped at the edge of the booth and looked down at both of them. and he produced a smile that reached all the parts of his face where smiles are supposed to reach, and reached none of the parts where they actually mean something. "I apologize for the interruption," he said. His voice was the voice of a man who had spent years in rooms where his voice was the one that determined what happened next. Controlled professional. The particular cadence of someone who had learned to deliver information in the tone of a man offering a reasonable suggestion rather than stating a position. "I believe there may be a misunderstanding." He gestured toward the old woman. "This is my mother. She experiences episodes of confusion occasionally, and she tends to wander when she is upset." The old woman pressed closer to Hank's arm. She said nothing. Hank looked at the man for a moment the way he used to look at situations in the army before deciding how to handle them, taking inventory of what he could see and what it suggested about what he could not see. "Is that so?" Hank said. The man nodded. His smile did not waver. He reached into his breast pocket and produced his phone and turned the screen toward Hank. A photograph. The old woman standing beside the man in front of a large house, both of them visible in clear daylight. The woman in a pale dress with pearl earrings and her hair neatly arranged the man's hand on her shoulder. She was smiling in the photograph. Hank looked at the photograph. He looked at it carefully, the way he looked at things that were asking him to believe something. And he saw it. The old woman in the photograph was wearing a ring on her right hand, a simple gold band plain and worn with age. She was wearing the same ring on her right hand tonight, visible below the wet cuff of her wool coat. Hank had grown up in a house with a grandmother who had buried her husband when Hank was 7 years old. He remembered watching her move her wedding ring from her left hand to her right hand on the morning after the funeral. And he remembered asking her why, and she had told him that it was something widows sometimes did, a way of keeping the ring close without pretending the marriage was still what it had been. He had never forgotten it. The old woman in this booth was a widow. The photograph showed her wearing her ring on her right hand. If she was a widow in the photograph, then the photograph was taken after her husband died. The man in the gray suit had been photographing her after her husband died. He had been watching her. Not recently. Not since she ran. He had been watching her since before she ran. Since before there was any reason to run unless you were the kind of person who created reasons and then watched to see how they developed. Hank set the phone down on the table. He looked at the man. He said, "My grandma says she does not know you." The man's smile tightened. The adjustment was small but visible. Not anger yet, but the precursor to it, the moment when a person who is accustomed to controlling situations becomes aware that the control is not absolute. "Sir," he said, "I understand you are trying to be helpful. This is a private family matter." Hank shrugged. "Looks like family already found her." The man looked at him steadily. Whatever he was calculating was finished now, and the result had not gone the way he wanted it to, and he had decided to try a different approach. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said. He leaned slightly toward the table and lowered his voice. "Let the woman come with me and you can finish your coffee in peace." The old woman's grip on his arm did not move. He could feel her breathing controlled and deliberate, the breathing of a woman who was very frightened, and had decided that being very frightened was not going to determine her behavior. Hank said nothing for a moment. He picked up his coffee mug. and took a slow sip and set it back down. Then he pushed himself to his feet. He unfolded slowly, the way very large men sometimes stand when they want the movement itself to be part of the conversation. And he rose to his full height and stood in the narrow space between the booth and the aisle and looked down at the man in the gray suit from a distance that was close enough to be deliberate, but not close enough to be a physical threat. The man took one small step back. That step told Hank everything he needed to know about the man's actual confidence, which was different from his performed confidence in the same way that a photograph of a fire is different from a fire. "She does not want to go," Hank said. The man looked up at him. The politeness had left his face entirely now. What was underneath it was not anger exactly. It was the expression of a person who has a mechanism available to them and has decided the time has come to use it. "You have no idea who you are interfering with," the man said. Hank said, "Probably not." He reached into his vest pocket and took out his phone and sent a text to Cord Bison Welch with 3 words, "Desert Hawk Diner." Then he slid the phone back into his pocket and looked at the man and waited. Outside, the second black SUV pulled into the parking lot. The man in the gray suit glanced toward the window and then back at Hank with a small restoration of confidence. He had not come alone, and now he wanted Hank to understand that he had not come alone. "I am trying to be reasonable," the man said, "but you are forcing my hand." Hank looked out at the second SUV in the parking lot. Then he looked back at the man. "Buddy," he said, "you picked the wrong diner for that speech." The diner door opened again. 2 men came in. They were not in gray suits. They were big men in dark jackets with a kind of stillness that belongs to men who are employed for their physical presence rather than their conversation. And they positioned themselves inside the door with the practiced ease of people who had done this kind of positioning before and had a general sense of how these situations tended to develop. Dot, the waitress behind the counter, had gone very still. Her hand was on the counter and her eyes were moving between the men at the door and the booth at the back. And she was doing the arithmetic of the situation with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had been reading rooms for 30 years. The 2 college students near the window had already picked up their bags. They were moving toward the restroom hallway with the careful speed of people who have correctly identified an exit and are not going to draw attention to the fact that they are using it. The trucker at the counter lifted his head, assessed what he was looking at, and pushed his plate quietly away from him. The man in the gray suit looked at Hank with the expression of a man presenting a concluded argument. "Last chance," he said. Hank looked down at the old woman in the booth. She was looking up at him with the dark, clear eyes that were still very afraid, and had decided apparently that being afraid was not enough of a reason to stop doing what she was doing. Then Hank looked back at the man. "Not happening," he said. The man in the gray suit drew himself up slightly. He nodded once to himself or to the 2 men at the door or to the mathematics of the situation, as he understood it. He had the numbers and he had the muscle and he had whatever authority he was accustomed to deploying, and he had decided that all of that was enough. He was about to say something else. That was when the sound reached them. It came from the highway first, faint and low below the range of the rain, but somehow cutting through it, a deep mechanical pulse that built from a suggestion into something you could feel in the floor of the diner before you could clearly identify it as sound. Hank knew what it was before anyone else in the room did, the same way you can recognize a voice before you can see the person speaking, because you have spent enough time with that particular voice to know it in the dark. Twin engines. Lots of them. The man in the gray suit noticed the change in Hank's expression. His eyes narrowed. What he said. Hank did not answer. Outside the plate glass windows, headlights appeared at the far end of the access road. Not one pair. Not two. A long procession of them, wide and steady, moving through the rain, with the deliberate formation of men who ride together regularly and know how to do it. They came off the highway in a line that stretched back farther than was entirely visible through the rain and the dark, and they turned onto the access road one after another, and the sound of their engines grew from a rumble into a roar that made the coffee mug on the table vibrate slightly against the surface. They filled the parking lot in under a minute. 23 motorcycles, chrome wet and gleaming in the rain. Engines idling in the syncopated rhythm of a group that has been riding together long enough to settle into each other's timing. The patches on the vests were the same on every rider. Hell's Angels Motorcycle Club. Different chapters, different roles, but the same back patch, the same identity, the same reason for being on Highway 50 on a November night in the rain. The man in the gray suit's composed expression had cracked. It was not fear exactly. It was the look of a man who had done his calculations correctly for the situation he expected to be in, and had arrived at the correct location and found a completely different situation. Hank said those would be my friends. The diner door opened. Cord Bison Welch came through it first. Ducking slightly to clear the frame, 300 pounds of man in wet leather. Removing his helmet and shaking the rain from his beard, and scanning the room with the quick, unhurried survey of someone who has walked into complicated situations before and has a general protocol for them. He spotted Hank in the corner. He looked at the man in the gray suit. He looked at the two men by the door. He looked at the old woman in the booth beside Hank. Then he looked back at the man in the gray suit. He folded his arms. He said, "We got a problem here." It was not a question. The man in the gray suit looked at Bison. He looked at the door behind Bison through which two more Hell's Angels members were coming, and two more behind them, filling the small diner with the smell of wet leather and cold night air, and the density that 23 large men who are not worried about the situation carry in their bodies. The two enforcers by the door exchanged a look. The calculation they were doing was the same one the man in the gray suit was doing, and they were arriving at the same result, which was that the numbers had changed in a direction that was not favorable to them. Hank looked at the man in the gray suit. Then he stepped aside and crouched slightly beside the booth and spoke quietly to the old woman. He said, "You want to tell me what is actually going on?" She looked at him. The fear was still in her eyes, but there was something else beside it now. Something that had been waiting behind the fear for long enough that it had developed its own pressure. The look of a person who has been carrying information they cannot share for long enough that the carrying has become its own kind of damage. She said, "My name is Ruth Calder. My husband was Owen Calder. He was a CPA. They hired him to do an audit, and he found things that were not supposed to be found. And 3 months later, he was dead. And now they want what he left behind. And I am the only one who has it." She reached into the canvas bag on the seat beside her and held up a manila envelope. thick with papers. Hank looked at the envelope. He looked at the man in the gray suit who was watching the envelope with an expression that told Hank everything he needed to know about how important it was. He said to Ruth, "How long have you been running?" She said, 3 days. He said, "Where were you going?" She looked at him. Something moved across her face, a brief complexity that he could not entirely read, but that suggested the answer was not a place. She said, "I was going here. I was going to find the Hells Angels." Hank looked at her. "He said you knew we would be here." She said, "Owen knew. He kept your schedule from the charity work you did in 2018. He said the November Memorial Ride was the same third week every year. He said to find the Hells Angels on Highway 50, and to say that Owen Calder sent me. He said they understand loyalty." The diner was quiet for a moment, the rain on the windows and the idling engines outside, and nothing else. Hank stood up. He took out his phone. He pulled up the text thread from earlier and added a number he had used a few times in the past for the purpose of running a plate. When running a plate was necessary, and he typed both plate numbers from the 2 black SUVs in the parking lot and sent the text. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his vest. He kept a small collection of things there. His registration and insurance card in a worn leather sleeve. A folded piece of paper with emergency contacts that he had not updated in 3 years and kept meaning to update. 2 military challenge coins that he had carried since 2007 and would carry until they buried him with them. And a card, a memorial card, the kind that gets printed for a service. Plain white stock, the Hells Angels emblem in the upper left corner, a name in the center. Deke Socket Pruitt, the dates of his birth and death. A single line underneath in the Hells Angels tradition. He rode hard, and he rode true. Hank had been carrying it for 10 days. He held it in his hand and looked at it for a moment. Then he turned it over. On the back, in his own handwriting from a week ago when he had been sitting in his shop trying to make the accident report make sense. He had written down every piece of information he had been able to find about the circumstances of Deke's death, the stretch of highway, the time, the weather conditions, the investigating officer's name, and 2 lines at the bottom that he had added after making a phone call to a club member who knew how to find things that were not easily found. Last known employer, Meridian Land Solutions. LLC subcontractor work. Winnemucca side, October and November. Hank looked at the memorial card. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. The reply was brief. It was the kind of reply that came from someone who pulled information efficiently and had learned not to add unnecessary context. Both plates registered to Meridian Land Solutions, LLC, Henderson, NV. Hank stood in the corner booth of the Desert Hawk Diner with the memorial card in one hand and his phone in the other, and the rain on the windows and 23 of his brothers filling the room behind him, and an old woman sitting in the booth with a manila envelope in her lap. And he stood very still for a moment. The same name. Deke had worked for Meridian on a site in Winnemucca the month before he died. Owen Calder had audited Meridian and found something and ended up dead. The SUVs in the parking lot belonged to Meridian. The man in the gray suit had come in one of those SUVs. Hank turned and looked at the man in the gray suit across the length of the diner. The man looked back at him. He was still composed. The crack that had appeared in his expression when the motorcycles arrived had resealed itself the way a very practiced person can reseal a crack in a performance, because the performance is something they have been maintaining for long enough that it operates somewhat independently of whatever is actually happening underneath it. But Hank had spent years reading men who were performing calm they did not feel, and he could see in the way the man held himself that the stillness was work. Bison had moved to stand behind the two men in dark jackets by the door, not close enough to be a physical threat, close enough to be a fact. Hank put his phone back in his pocket, and he put the memorial card back in the inside pocket of his vest against his chest, where it had been for 10 days. He looked at Ruth Calder in the booth. He pulled out the other side of the bench and sat across from her, leaning forward with his forearms on the table, and he spoke quietly enough that the words were for her and not for anyone else in the room. He said, "Tell me what Owen found." She looked at him. The fear was still there and would probably be there for a long time, but it had moved slightly behind something else. Now the same thing that had kept her running for 3 days and had put her on Highway 50 on a rainy Wednesday night, looking for a motorcycle club based on a note her dead husband had left in case something happened to him. She said, "How much do you want to know?" Hank said, "All of it." She opened the manila envelope. Outside, the 23 Hells Angels motorcycles sat in the rain, with their engines idling a wall of chrome and leather and V-twin sound that filled the Desert Hawk parking lot and was visible from the highway. And the two black SUVs sat on the other side of the lot, like dark punctuation marks in a sentence that had not finished being written. The man in the gray suit stood in the middle of the diner and watched Hank Morse sit down across from Ruth Calder and did not move. Dot, the waitress, came around the counter with a coffee pot and refilled Hank's mug and set a fresh mug in front of Ruth without being asked, and went back behind the counter without a word. And when she got back behind the counter, she moved her hands slowly, and without drawing attention to it, toward the telephone mounted on the wall beside the pass-through window, the landline she had been using since 1987, the one she kept because she did not trust cellular signals in dead zones, and because there were numbers in her head that did not need to be in a phone to be remembered. She did not pick it up yet. She waited. She had been reading rooms for 30 years, and she knew that this room was not finished yet, and that the moment to act would make itself clear when it arrived, the way moments like that always did, if you were paying attention. She was paying attention. Ruth Calder spread the contents of the manila envelope on the table between them, the way a person lays out evidence they have been carrying alone for too long carefully, and with the specific relief of someone finally setting down a weight they were not sure they could continue carrying. There were papers, a lot of them, printed spreadsheets with columns of numbers annotated in a small, precise handwriting that Hank assumed was Owen Calder's. Photocopied documents with letterhead from something called Meridian Land Solutions, LLC, and sub-entities with names like Desert Basin Holdings and Western Corridor Partners and Sage Creek Development Group, a USB drive in a small plastic case, and a handwritten list on a single sheet of yellow legal paper. 9 names written in the same small, precise hand, each one followed by a date and a brief notation. Hank looked at the papers without touching them. He said, "Start from the beginning, not the end. The beginning." Ruth folded her hands on the table. She was still trembling, but less than before, the way a person stops trembling when they have committed to something. And the commitment itself provides a kind of steadiness that the fear had been preventing. She said Owen retired from his practice in Flagstaff in 2019. He had been a CPA for 31 years. After he retired, he did some consulting work, mostly small businesses. Nothing complicated. Then, in the spring of 2022, he was contacted by a man named Gann. He said he was with a federal land management office and that they had a routine audit requirement for a private development contractor that worked on federal land projects. He said Owen came highly recommended. She paused. She said Owen was pleased. He had been retired for 3 years, and he missed working. He liked numbers. He liked the precision of them, the way they told you exactly what was true if you knew how to read them. He thought this would be something useful to do. Hank said, when did he figure out it was not routine? Ruth looked at the papers on the table. She said, 8 weeks in. He found a discrepancy in the land valuation records for a project in Nye County. A parcel that had been appraised at one value on the federal acquisition documents and a different value on the internal Meridian records, with the difference going into an account that was not in the audit scope he had been given. He flagged it as an anomaly and asked for the supporting documentation. Hank said, and they gave it to him. She said they gave him documents, but Owen had been reading financial documents for 31 years and he knew the difference between documents that had been created to explain something and documents that had been created to replace something. These were replacements. The original records had been altered, and what he was given was a reconstruction. A very good reconstruction. But not good enough for Owen. She reached across the table and touched the edge of one of the spreadsheets without picking it up. She said he spent the next 6 weeks working backward through 4 years of transactions across 14 projects in 3 states. He did it quietly. He did not tell Gann what he had found. He printed everything because he did not trust digital records that lived on servers he did not control. And he brought the physical copies home, and he kept them in a box in the closet of his study that he told me contained old tax records from the practice. Hank said he did not tell you what he was doing. She said not until October of last year. Not until he was sure. Owen did not share unfinished things. He said there was no point in frightening someone over a suspicion. Hank said what was the number. She looked at him. He said when he was sure. What was the number? She said $240 million over 4 years, distributed across 11 shell entities in 4 states and 3 offshore accounts. Federal land acquisition funds, infrastructure development, appropriations, environmental mitigation budgets. All of it filtered through Meridian's project structure and redirected. The federal projects got built or partially built because the projects were real. But somewhere between 30 and 40% of the allocated funds went somewhere else. Hank was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain continued. The Hells Angels' engines had gone quiet now. The riders having dismounted and come inside, filling the booths and the counter stools, and the spaces between them with the patient presence of men who had arrived and were waiting to understand what they had arrived for. Bison was at the counter with a coffee mug. The 2 men in dark jackets who had positioned themselves at the door earlier had moved to a booth near the entrance, no longer quite as posed, recalculating. Fletcher Gann had not left. He had moved to a table near the window where he sat alone with his phone making calls in a low voice that did not carry his expression. Composed, but his eyes moving regularly to the corner booth where Hank and Ruth sat. Hank said, so he went to the authorities. Ruth was quiet. He looked at her. She said he tried. He contacted the Office of Inspector General for the Department of Interior in November of last year. He was told his complaint was being reviewed. He heard nothing for 6 weeks. He contacted them again in January and was told the matter had been referred to another office and that he would be contacted when appropriate. He was never contacted. Hank said someone buried the complaint. Ruth said Owen believed so. He did not know who or at what level. He only knew that the channels he had tried were not open. So he went to a congressman's office in February. A staff member took his information and told him someone would follow up. No one followed up. She paused again. The pauses had a rhythm to them, the rhythm of a person who has rehearsed a story enough times that they know exactly where the weight falls and where they need to stop and let the weight settle before continuing. She said in March he was contacted by a man who said he was a journalist working on a story about federal land management oversight. Owen agreed to meet with him. He spent 3 hours explaining everything he had found. The journalist took notes and said he would be in touch within 2 weeks. She looked at the table. She said 2 weeks later, Owen found an article published under that journalist's name in a trade publication. The article said that recent auditing processes for federal land acquisition projects had been reviewed and found to be fully compliant. It quoted unnamed sources from within the Department of Interior. It did not mention Owen or his findings. It did not mention Meridian. It read like a preemptive answer to a question that had not been publicly asked. Hank understood what that meant. He had seen similar mechanics in different contexts, the way institutions close around vulnerabilities, not through overt action, but through the application of access and relationship, and the kind of pressure that leaves no marks, because it operates entirely through the normal channels of professional life. The journalist had been managed. The complaint had been managed. Owen Calder had spent 6 months trying to find a door that was not already locked from the inside. He said, "When did it stop being about the money?" Ruth looked up at him. He said, "When did Owen understand that whoever was running this was not going to let a CPA from Flagstaff take it apart?" She said, "April." He received a phone call in April. The caller did not identify himself. He said that Owen had been thorough, and that his work was impressive, and that it would be a shame if a man his age, with his health history, were to overexert himself. Owen had a cardiac event 3 years ago, a mild one managed with medication. The caller knew about it. He knew the name of Owen's cardiologist and the name of the medication, and the date of the last appointment. Hank said nothing. She said Owen came into the kitchen after that call, and he sat down and he told me everything. All of it, from the beginning. He sat at our kitchen table and he talked for 2 hours, and when he was done, he said he was sorry he had not told me sooner, and that he was going to figure out how to handle it, and that in the meantime he needed to make some arrangements. She touched the yellow legal paper with her fingertip. She said 3 weeks after that call, Owen died in his car on Route 89 north of Prescott at 11 in the morning on a dry, clear Tuesday. The official report said he suffered a cardiac event while driving and the car left the road. His medication was found in the vehicle. His cardiologist confirmed he had been managing his condition appropriately. The medical examiner found nothing inconsistent with natural causes. She said it the way she had clearly said it many times since April, with the flatness of a person who has processed a fact to the point where it no longer produces the same acute pain, but has become something else, something that lives in the body differently, as a kind of permanent weight rather than a recurring wound. Hank said, "But you do not believe it was natural." She said Owen was in good health. His most recent cardiac appointment was 2 weeks before he died. His cardiologist told him his numbers were better than the previous year. He had no symptoms. He was walking 3 miles every morning and sleeping well and eating carefully. And the call had come 6 weeks before he died. She stopped. Then she said, "And he left me instructions. A man who believes he is going to die naturally does not leave his wife a set of instructions for what to do if something happens to him." Owen left me a sealed envelope in the back of the closet behind the box of papers. He told me where it was. He said I would know when to open it. Hank said, "And you opened it when he died?" She said yes. He said, "What did it say?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, it said that everything he had found was in the box in hard copy and on the USB drive in an encrypted file with a password he gave me. It said not to trust local law enforcement or federal agencies or anyone who presented themselves as official channels because the official channels had already been compromised, and she had seen for herself that this was true. It said to run if anyone came looking for the materials and to take the box and the drive and to go to Highway 50 in Nevada in the 3rd week of November and find the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club and to say that Owen Calder sent her. It said that the Hells Angels understood what loyalty meant and would help her find someone who could actually open a door. She looked at Hank. She said it took me 4 months to be ready. After he died, there was the funeral and the arrangements and the grief that makes everything take longer than it should. And then there was the surveillance. They began watching the house within 2 weeks of Owen's death. A car parked on the street. Different cars on different days, but always there. I started running small errands just to see, and the car would follow me to the grocery store and back. I told no one because I did not know who was safe to tell. I waited. I planned. Hank said, "And 3 days ago you left." She said I had a neighbor who was going to her daughter's house for a week. I asked to use her car. I drove it to Tucson and left it at the airport and took a bus to Las Vegas and another bus to Tonopah. I walked to the highway from the Tonopah station. I've been at a motel in Tonopah for 2 days waiting for the right night to be on this road. She paused. She said they found me faster than I expected. I do not know how. The motel, perhaps, or a camera somewhere along the route. I saw Gann's car in the motel parking lot this evening, and I walked out the back and started walking along the highway in the rain. She said it, matter-of-factly, an elderly woman of 74, walking along a Nevada highway in a November rainstorm to escape the men who she believed had killed her husband, as if this were a thing that had simply needed to be done. And so she had done it. Hank looked at her for a long moment. He said the list, the 9 names. "Can I see it?" She reached across the papers and slid the yellow legal sheet toward him. He picked it up. The names were written in Owen's small, precise handwriting, each one followed by a date and a brief notation in parentheses. He read them from the top. The first name was a woman in Utah dated 14 months ago. Automobile accident. The second was a man in New Mexico 11 months ago. Drowning. The third was a man in California 9 months ago. Heart failure. He read the fourth and the fifth and the sixth. He read the seventh. He stopped. The handwriting on the page did not change. The yellow paper did not change. The sounds in the diner did not change the rain on the windows and the low conversation of the Hells Angels members at the counter. And the idling of a vehicle in the parking lot. None of it changed. But something inside Hank Morse went very quiet. The seventh name was Deke Pruitt. Winnemucca, Nevada. Vehicle incident Y80. The date was 10 days ago. He read it twice. He read it the way you read something that you have already understood and are reading again. Not because the words might change, but because some part of the mind believes that repetition constitutes confirmation, and that confirmation is necessary before the next thing can happen. Bison had moved to stand behind Hank at some point in the last few minutes quietly, and without drawing attention to himself the way very large men who have been doing this kind of thing for a long time learn to move. He was looking over Hank's shoulder at the page. Hank was aware of Bison reading it. He was aware of Bison going still. He did not look up at Bison. He folded the sheet of yellow paper slowly and put it in the inside pocket of his vest against the memorial card that had been there for 10 days. Then he set both hands flat on the table and looked at Ruth Calder. She was watching him. She had been watching him read the list, and she had seen the change, whatever it was, the brief stillness in his face when he reached the seventh name. And she was watching him now, with an expression that contained something new, something that had not been there before, a kind of careful attention that was waiting to see what kind of man this was going to turn out to be in the moment after the thing. She had just watched him process. He said, "The Winnemucca site. Tell me specifically what Owen found there. Every number. Every name he documented." She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once, and she began, and this time she went into the details he needed. And Hank listened with the kind of attention that he had once given to operational briefings in places where the quality of his listening determined whether people lived or died. She told him about Owen's methodology at Winnemucca, the specific way he had reconstructed the physical delivery records against the billing documentation. She told him about the concrete discrepancy over $60 million in a single project year at that site alone. The difference between what was invoiced and what was actually poured. She told him that Owen believed Winnemucca was the largest single instance of diversion in the entire 4-year operation, and that it was the project where the gap between paper and ground was most visible to anyone who had eyes on both. "Hank," said the USB drive, "is it on you?" She reached into the canvas bag and set it on the table beside the envelope. A small drive in a clear plastic case, the kind you could buy at any drugstore for $8. Owen Calder had put $240 million in evidence on an $8 drive and trusted his wife to carry it across 3 states in the rain. Hank said the password. She recited it from memory. A sequence of numbers and letters that was clearly not random, clearly something Owen had designed to be memorable to her and not guessable by anyone else. She said it once quietly, and Hank repeated it to himself twice and put it in the part of his mind where he stored things that needed to stay there. He said nobody else knows this password. She said no one. He started to say something else. The door opened. The man who came in was wearing a khaki uniform with a county sheriff's patch on the shoulder and a badge that caught the fluorescent light above the door. He was 55, broad through the chest and thick in the jaw, with the deliberate authority that some men in uniforms carry as their primary professional attribute. His name tag said Voss. Sheriff Dale Voss stepped inside the Desert Hawk Diner and looked at the room the way a man looks at a room he expected to find in a particular condition and is found instead in a considerably different one. His eyes moved from the Hells Angels members at the counter and booths to the two men in dark jackets near the entrance to the corner booth, where Hank sat across from Ruth. He settled on the corner booth. He said, "I'm going to need everyone from the Hells Angels to step outside." No greeting, no identification of who he was talking to specifically. Just the statement delivered in the tone of a man who expected statements delivered in that tone to produce the results they historically had produced. Bison turned around from where he was standing behind the booth. He said, "Evening, Sheriff." Voss said, "I am not here for pleasantries. I have received a report of a disturbance at this location involving motorcycle club members, and I am asking all non-employees and non-patrons to clear the premises." Bison said, "We are patrons. We have been drinking coffee for the last 20 minutes. Voss said, "I need you to step outside." From across the diner, from the table near the window, Fletcher Gann stood up. He did not say anything. He did not need to. He crossed the diner floor and took a position to the left of Sheriff Voss. Not beside him exactly, not quite close enough to be standing with him, but close enough to be in the same frame. A subtle positioning, the kind that said these two men had spoken before tonight, and the speaking had produced a general understanding of where each of them stood. Hank noted the positioning. He noted the fact that Voss had arrived without a deputy, which was the kind of decision that told you something about how a man expected a situation to go. He noted that Voss had not acknowledged Gann's presence or the presence of the two men in dark jackets, both of whom had been inside the diner before Voss arrived, and were not by any reasonable definition simply patrons. Ruth had gone still beside the papers on the table. She had seen Voss come in, and she had registered the way he moved to the same side of the room as Gann without appearing to do so intentionally. And her hands had folded over the canvas bag in her lap with the quiet, instinctive motion of someone protecting something. Hank looked at Voss. He did not stand up. He stayed seated, which was its own kind of communication. The decision to require the person asserting authority to come to the level of the conversation, rather than the conversation rising to meet the assertion. He said, "We are going to need to see some documentation of that disturbance report." Voss said, "That is not how this works." Hank said, "A concerned citizen can request documentation of the complaint that prompted law enforcement activity. That is absolutely how this works." Voss looked at him. His jaw tightened. He said, "Son, I have been the sheriff of this county for 16 years. Hank said, "And I have been a citizen of this country for 45 years. So between the two of us, we have 61 years of experience with how things work. And I am telling you that I am going to need to see documentation before any member of this club goes anywhere." Bison folded his arms. Around the diner, the Hells Angels members had gone quiet and attentive, not moving, not threatening, simply present in the way of a group that has arrived at a moment of decision and is ready for whatever the moment requires. Voss looked at the room. He counted what was in it. He was a man who had relied on the authority of his position for 16 years, and authority had served him well. And he was encountering the situation in which authority without backup meets a large number of very calm people who have decided that the authority does not apply to them, and the calculation he was doing was visible on his face, in the way of a man who has always been good at arithmetic, and is finding that the numbers are not cooperating. Gan beside him said nothing. He was watching Hank with the flat, watchful attention of someone waiting for an error. Hank looked at Voss and nodded at Gan. He said, "You are going to want to think very carefully about the next thing you do." He said it quietly, and without emphasis, the way you say something that does not need emphasis, because the meaning carries itself. Voss held his position for a moment. His hand was near his belt, not on anything, just near the kind of positioning that was meant to be read as preparedness and that Hank read as uncertainty. Then something happened in the back of the diner, a minor and unremarkable thing. The sound of a door opening and closing the door to the kitchen and storage area that Dot, the waitress, used to move between the counter and the back of the building. Dot herself was visible behind the counter pouring coffee for a man. At the far end, her movements unhurried. But the sound of that door was the sound of someone who had been in the back room and had just returned to the front. No one in the room paid much attention to it. Hank paid attention to it. He had been watching Dot Hanley since the moment he sat down in this diner. The way he watched everyone in a room, because watching everyone in a room was the kind of habit you developed when the quality of your attention was the difference between knowing what was happening and finding out about it too late. He had watched her go still when Gan came in. He had watched her assessment of the room when the Hells Angels arrived, the way her eyes had moved, not with fear, but with the calculation of someone determining what was available and what needed to be done with it. He had watched her hand move toward the wall phone when Voss came in. He looked at her now across the counter. She was pouring coffee. She did not look at him, but she had done something in that back room. He did not know what yet, but she had done something. Gan spoke for the first time since Voss arrived. He spoke quietly, not to the room, to Voss. He said we should step outside. Voss looked at him. A long moment passed. Then Voss straightened his shoulders and looked at Hank and said, "This is not finished." Hank said, "I know." Voss turned and walked back to the door and went through it. And Gan followed him, and the two men in dark jackets looked at each other, and then at the Hells Angels members filling the diner, and then made the same decision and followed. The door closed. The diner was quiet for a moment. The rain, the refrigerator compressor behind the counter cycling on, the distant sound of vehicles in the parking lot. Then Bison exhaled. He said that was a sheriff. Hank said that was a problem wearing a sheriff's uniform. Bison looked at the door and then at Hank. He said, "So now what?" Hank looked at the USB drive on the table. He looked at the papers. He had a number in his contacts for a man named Ray Corbin, who had left the Hells Angels 8 years ago to join the FBI field office in Reno. The departure had been handled honestly, which was why the number was still there. He thought about calling it. Then he thought about Owen Calder calling official channels for 6 months and watching everything disappear. He put the phone back in his pocket. He needed to understand what he had more fully before he pointed it at anyone. He said to Ruth, "I need the Winnemucca site personnel records specifically. Whatever Owen had about the contractor crews." Ruth slid several of the printed spreadsheets toward him, and he sat forward and began reading. And the diner settled into the quiet of a room full of people who are waiting while one person works, and the rain continued outside. And in the parking lot, the vehicles belonging to Gann and Voss sat with their engines running in the dark. Dot Hanley wiped down the counter. She moved methodically from one end to the other, refilling cups without being asked, not speaking unless spoken to. Her face was neutral, and her movements were unhurried. But her eyes were calm, in a way that was different from the calm they had been before she went into the back room. Whatever she had done in there, she had done it cleanly, and it was done, and now she was waiting the way you wait when you have set something in motion that will take time to arrive, with the patience of a person who has made a decision and trusts it. Outside, the rain was beginning to ease. Hank found what he was looking for in the 14th page of Owen Calder's Winnemucca spreadsheets at 20 minutes past 2 in the morning. It was a personnel cross-reference list, the kind of document that a thorough auditor produces when they are trying to establish which human beings had physical access to which project elements at which times. Because financial fraud that involves physical construction, projects always has a gap between what the paper says and what the ground says, and the gap is only visible to the people who were standing on the ground. Owen had pulled contractor personnel records from the Winnemucca site going back 18 months. He had cross-referenced them against billing records and material delivery logs and site inspection reports. And in the margin of the 14th page, in the small, precise handwriting that Hank had been reading for 2 hours, Owen had written a single annotation next to a line item for October subcontractor labor. The annotation said this man saw the concrete delivery discrepancy, noted it to site foreman November 3rd. Foreman's response not documented. Follow up. The name on the line item was Deke Pruitt. Hank sat with that page for a moment. He did not need the moment to understand what it meant. He understood it immediately and completely, the way you understand something that you have been building toward without knowing it. The final piece arriving not with surprise, but with the weight of a thing that has been true all along and is only now visible. Deke had seen a discrepancy in a concrete delivery on a Meridian site in Winnemucca in October. He had mentioned it to his foreman. The foreman had said nothing or had said something that was not worth documenting, which meant the foreman was either complicit or had immediately understood that the discrepancy was not the kind of thing you mentioned out loud in that particular context. And 10 days ago, Deke Pruitt had died on I-80 at 4:30 in the morning in what the Nevada Highway Patrol had classified as a single vehicle accident involving road debris. Hank set the page down. He looked across the diner at Fletcher Gann, who had come back inside an hour ago, after his conversation with Sheriff Voss in the parking lot, and had resumed his position at the table near the window phone in hand, making calls in a low voice that did not carry his expression composed, but his eyes moving regularly to the corner booth. Hank understood the urgency now. Gann had come to the Desert Hawk Diner to retrieve a set of documents and a USB drive from a 74-year-old woman who was supposed to be alone and frightened and easy to manage. Instead, he had found 23 Hells Angels members and a man who had spent 8 years in the United States Army learning how to hold a position under pressure. And now it was 2 in the morning and the documents were still in the diner, and the woman was still in the diner. And nothing that Gann had tried had changed either of those facts. The calls Gann was making were to someone above him, Hank could see it in the posture, the way a man holds himself differently when he is reporting upward than when he is directing downward. The slight forward lean. Gann was not managing this situation anymore. He was describing it to someone who was going to decide what happened next. Hank looked at Bison, who was at the counter with his third cup of coffee, and he made a small gesture with his chin toward the door. Bison nodded and moved casually to the entrance and stepped outside. He came back in 2 minutes later and stopped beside the booth. He said quietly, "Voss is still in the parking lot. His cruiser is at the far end. He has not left, and he has not called for backup as far as I can tell." Hank said Gann told him to wait. A county sheriff waiting in a parking lot on the instruction of a man in a gray suit at 2 in the morning was a county sheriff who had made a decision about whose authority mattered more in his professional life. And that decision had long since been made and was no longer reversible by anything that was gonna happen in this diner tonight. Hank stood up. He put the 14th page in the inside pocket of his vest beside the yellow legal paper and the memorial card. He looked at Ruth. He looked at the USB drive on the table. He looked at the OIG hotline number he had found on his phone browser and written on the paper napkin from under his coffee mug. Then he walked to the center of the room, not the far corner, not a lowered voice. The center of the room between the counter and the row of booths, the place where his voice would carry most clearly to every part of the space. He dialed the number and put the phone to his ear. The line connected on the third ring. He said, "I need to report ongoing criminal activity involving a senior Department of Interior official. His name is Fletcher Gann. He holds the title of Deputy Director within the Federal Land Management Division. He is currently present at a location in Esmeralda County, Nevada, and has been attempting to suppress physical evidence of a federal fraud operation involving approximately $240 million in misdirected federal land acquisition funds over a 4-year period. I have physical documentation and a digital record of the full transaction history. I have a list of 9 individuals who are believed to have been killed to prevent disclosure of this information, one of whom died 10 days ago on Interstate 80 near Winnemucca, Nevada, in an incident classified as an accident. I am a civilian with no pending legal matters, and I am prepared to cooperate fully with any authorized investigation." He read the vehicle registration numbers. He read Gann's description and current location. He read 2 of the entity names from Owen's documents, the ones that appeared most prominently across the transaction records. He gave his own name and his phone number. He did not read the 9 names. He said, "I will provide the complete documentation to any authorized federal investigator who contacts me at this number within the next 6 hours. After 6 hours, I will be making alternative arrangements." He ended the call. The diner was completely quiet. Every Hell's Angels member in the room was looking at him. Ruth was looking at him. Dot at the counter was looking at him. The trucker who had been at the counter since before this all started, and who had quietly and with considerable wisdom decided that leaving was not an option, and that being invisible was the next best alternative, was looking at him. Across the diner, Fletcher Gann was looking at him, and Gann had heard it. Not all of it, and perhaps not clearly, but enough. The name. His own name spoken at full volume in the center of a diner by a man calling a federal oversight body at 2 in the morning. Enough. What moved across Gann's face in the moment after the call ended was not fear. It was the expression of a man watching a landscape change while he is standing in it. the recognition that the terrain has shifted in a way that requires immediate recalculation, and that the recalculation is going to produce results he is not going to like. He stood up. He walked outside without looking at anyone. 30 seconds later, Bison, who had positioned himself near the window, said quietly, "Voss is leaving." Hank heard the cruiser pull out of the parking lot, the sound of it receding down the access road toward the highway. Not fast, not slow. The speed of a man who has received information and is processing what it means for the decisions he has made and is going to have to continue making. Bison said Gann is still out there. Hank said, "I know." He sat back down across from Ruth. She said, "What did you just do?" He said, "I opened a door that Gann cannot close, not quickly. The OIG hotline creates an automatic intake record the moment a call is logged. Suppressing that record requires internal action at the OIG, which is separate from interior, and requires documentation of its own. Whatever protection Gann has had until now operated by preventing complaints from becoming records. That complaint is now a record." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Will someone actually respond?" He said, "Someone will respond. Whether the right someone responds fast enough is a different question, which is why we are not done yet." He looked at the window. Outside, Gann was on his phone. The call was different now, visible even through the plate glass. Gann was not reporting upward with controlled professionalism. He was describing an emergency to someone, and the someone was making decisions in real time. Hank recognized that quality. He said to Bison, "Something else is coming. Get everyone ready to hold the room." Bison said, "For what?" Hank said, "I do not know yet. But Gann is calling in whatever he has left, and it is going to arrive within the next hour." Bison moved back to the counter and spoke quietly to two of the senior Hells Angels members sitting there, and the quiet spread through the room without drama. Men adjusting their positions slightly. No urgency. No visible alarm. The readiness of people who have been in rooms like this before and know how to carry readiness without advertising it. Ruth had collected the papers from the table back into the manila envelope and held the canvas bag in her lap with both hands. Hank said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I have been more frightened than this, though not recently." He said Owen chose well. She looked at him. Something moved through her eyes briefly. A flash of something that was not quite grief and not quite pride, but was in the neighborhood of both. She said he chose the Hells Angels because he believed you were people who meant what you said. He said most organizations in his experience said things and meant something else, and that the gap between the saying and the meaning was where most of the damage in the world occurred. He said he had watched the Hells Angels at that charity event in 2018, and they were the same at the end of the day as they were at the beginning when the work was unglamorous and no one was watching, and he thought that was rare enough to be worth trusting. Hank said nothing. She said he was right, wasn't he? Hank looked at the room. 22 of his brothers spread across the booths and the counter and the open floor of a small diner in the Nevada desert at 2:30 in the morning. Because one of them had sent a text that said 3 words, and that was enough. He said, yeah. He was right. The vehicle arrived at 3:15. Not the black SU Vaz, a different vehicle. A dark sedan, newer, with Nevada state plates that Bison photographed through the window and sent to the same contact who had run the Meridian plates earlier. The result came back in 4 minutes. The vehicle was registered to the Nevada State Legislative Services Office. A man got out. He was older than Gann by nearly a decade, 61 or 62, with the broad build of a man who had been larger in his physical prime and was still substantial in the diminished version. He wore a coat over a dress shirt with no tie. The clothes of a man who had been reached by phone in the middle of the night and had dressed without the usual care. His hair was silver, and his face was the face that Hank had seen on political mailers and on the occasional television segment about Nevada land development policy. Over the years, a face designed to read as trustworthy from the second row of a town hall meeting. Senator Boyd Crutchfield, Nevada State Legislature. 3 terms. Chairman of the Natural Resources and Public Lands Committee, which was the committee that oversaw federal land management contracts in Nevada, which was the oversight position from which a person could ensure that complaints about federal land management contractors were routed in the appropriate direction, which was away from anyone who might act on them. He stood outside the diner for a moment in conversation with Gann. Hank could see them through the window. Gann speaking quickly, Crutchfield listening with the expression of a man who was being briefed on a problem he believed had been managed, and is discovering that it has not been managed at the level he required. Then Crutchfield walked toward the diner entrance. He came through the door with the authority that belongs to men who have spent decades walking into rooms and having the rooms adjust to their presence. He was accustomed to being recognized. He was accustomed to the way recognition changed the atmosphere of a space, the way people became slightly more careful and slightly more performative when someone important entered. He had been using that quality for 30 years, and it had become as automatic as breathing. He scanned the room. He saw the Hells Angels members. He took that in. He saw Hank in the corner booth. He saw Ruth beside him. He began walking toward the booth with the measured pace of a man coming to resolve something privately and professionally before it became something else. He got 4 steps inside the door. Bison was at the counter directly in his path. 300 pounds of man with his arms folded and no particular expression on his face. Bison said, "Can I help you?" Crutchfield said, "I need to speak with the woman in the corner booth." Bison said, "She is in a private conversation." Crutchfield looked at him. He reached into his coat and produced a business card and held it out with the gesture of a man who has found that business cards open most doors. Bison looked at the card. He took it. He looked at it for a moment. He said, "Senator, good evening." He set the card on the counter. He did not move. Crutchfield looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating. Then he looked past Bison to Hank. He said, "Mr. Morse, my name is Boyd Crutchfield. I am a state senator, and I would like to speak with you privately about a situation that I believe can be resolved without further difficulty for anyone involved." Hank looked at him. He said, "You can speak from there." A small adjustment in Crutchfield's expression. The politician's training, the ability to absorb a setback and maintain the surface, was visible as technique rather than genuine composure. The gears of it slightly audible. He said, "What has been described to me as a misunderstanding has apparently escalated unnecessarily. I believe there are facts in play that have not been fully communicated, and I would like the opportunity to clarify the situation." Hank said, "I know what Meridian Land Solutions is. I know what the federal land acquisition funds were used for. I know who oversaw the contracts. I know that Owen Calder filed a complaint that was managed away. And I know what managed away means in that context. And I have called the OIG hotline and given them Fletcher Gann's name and title and current location, which means whatever you came here to clarify is already in a federal intake system that neither of us can reach. Crutchfield stood very still. He said, "You do not fully understand the situation you are in." Hank said, "I understand it precisely." A silence. Crutchfield looked around the room slowly. He looked at the Hells Angels members spread across the diner. None of them moving, all of them watching him with the patient attention of men who had long since decided what side of the room they were on. He looked at Ruth, holding her canvas bag, looking back at him with the clear, dark eyes of a woman who had been frightened for months and had come out the other side of the fear into something else. He looked at the trucker at the counter who was looking at him with the expression of a man who has been present at something significant and knows it and is not gonna look away. He looked at Dot Hanley. Dot was behind the counter with the coffee pot in her hand. She was not pouring coffee. She was looking at Crutchfield with an expression Hank had not seen on her face before. Not the neutral, professional calm she had maintained for the past 3 hours, but something more specific. The expression of a woman who has done a thing and is watching to see whether the thing is gonna work. At that moment, the headlights appeared on the access road. Not a federal vehicle. Not a law enforcement vehicle. A 10-year-old Subaru wagon that pulled into the parking lot and stopped, and 2 people got out, one carrying a camera bag over his shoulder. They came through the door. The man in front was in his late 50s, with the look of a person who has been woken from sleep, and has made no effort to conceal this fact, rumpled in the way of a man who considers his appearance irrelevant to his function. He had a press credential on a lanyard around his neck. His name was Walt Fenwick, and he was a reporter for the Reno Gazette-Journal, the investigative unit specifically, and he had been following the financial trails of Nevada public lands contracts for 14 months without being able to get the kind of documented evidence that turned a suspicion into a publishable story. He came through the door and looked at the room and looked at Dot, and then looked at Crutchfield. Something happened on Crutchfield's face that Hank had not seen happen on a face in a long time. It was not fear in the ordinary sense. It was the recognition that belongs to a person who has spent their career managing information and controlling narrative, and who has just understood that the information has escaped the management and the narrative is beyond control, and that the understanding arrives not as a shock, but as a kind of completion. The way a long calculation arrives at its result inevitable once the numbers were in place. Crutchfield said quietly, not to anyone in particular who called you. Fenwick said, "I get calls, Senator." That is how journalism works. Dot set the coffee pot on the counter. She said, "My husband used to say that if you want something done right, call someone who does it for a living." She said it to no one and to everyone. And then she picked up the coffee pot again and moved down the counter, refilling cups with the same unhurried competence she had been bringing to the Desert Hawk Diner for the past 30 years. Hank looked at her. She did not look at him, but the side of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile and was more than nothing. Crutchfield turned toward the door. Bison was there, not blocking, not threatening, simply present in the concentrated way that 300 pounds of very calm man is present in a doorframe, which is a way that requires a certain kind of determination to move past. Hank said, "Senator, you should stay." Crutchfield turned back. He said, "On what basis?" Hank said, "Because walking out of this room right now, past a reporter and a photographer and 30 witnesses is gonna look like exactly what it is. And because whatever story you were going to tell tonight, the story that Fenwick writes is the one that exists tomorrow morning." A long silence. Fenwick had moved to the side of the room with his notebook out. The photographer had the camera up, not pointing it, not yet, just up. Crutchfield looked at the camera. He looked at the notebook. He looked at the faces in the room. All of them turned toward him, and he performed the calculation that was available to him. He was a senator. He had handled difficult situations before. He had resources and relationships and the protective advantage of an institution that did not easily release its members to consequence. He had survived smaller versions of this kind of exposure before by controlling the narrative quickly and presenting a counter-story before the first story could solidify. But the first story was in this room. The OIG call was in the federal system. Owen Calder's documents were in that canvas bag and on that USB drive organized by a 31-year CPA who had spent the last months of his life making sure the story was comprehensible to anyone who needed to read it. Walt Fenwick had been following the money for 14 months and knew enough to understand what he was looking at the moment someone showed it to him. And the woman who had called Fenwick was standing behind the counter with a coffee pot. And she had eyes that missed nothing, and a landline that worked in dead zones, and a husband who had taught her to call the right person when calling the right person was what the situation required. Crutchfield sat down, not in the corner booth, at a table near the middle of the room in a chair with his coat still on, in the posture of a man who has not surrendered, but who has stopped moving and is determining what the next move looks like, in a landscape he no longer controls. Hank looked at him for a moment, and then looked away. He had done what needed to be done with Crutchfield. What happened to Crutchfield now was not in Hank's hands, and was not required to be. The OIG call was made. Fenwick was here. The documents existed. The night was moving toward morning, and morning was going to carry everything in it to wherever it needed to go. He looked at Ruth. She was looking at Crutchfield. She had not looked away from him since he sat down, and her expression was the expression of a woman who has spent months running from the thing she is now looking directly at, and has arrived at the other side of the running, and is determining what it feels like to be still. He said to her quietly, "You okay?" She said, "I am trying to decide whether I feel what I thought I would feel." He said, "What did you think you would feel?" She said, "Relief. Mostly I feel tired." He said, "That is relief. It just feels different than you expected." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Owen would have liked you." Hank said nothing. She reached into her canvas bag. She brought out an envelope separate from the manila envelope of documents. A personal envelope letter sized, sealed with nothing written on the outside except a date from 6 months ago. She held it for a moment. She said, "Owen left this with the documents. He wrote a note saying it was for the Hells Angels. He said if the club helped me, the letter was theirs to open. If no one helped me, I was to destroy it." She held it out to Hank. He looked at the envelope. He took it carefully, the way you take something from a person when you understand that the giving of it is significant. He turned it over. The back flap was sealed. His name was not on it because Owen Calder had not known his name, but the envelope was meant for him as completely as if it had been addressed to him directly. He did not open it in the diner. He put it in his vest pocket, in the inside pocket, in the same place where the memorial card had been for 10 days, and where the yellow legal paper with 9 names had been for the past 3 hours. He said, "I will read it when we are done here." She nodded. His phone rang at 4:15. A number he did not recognize. An OIG duty officer confirming his report and telling him to remain at his location. They were already driving from Reno. He confirmed it. He remained. The federal vehicles arrived at 4:40 in the morning, 2 of them dark, SUVs different from the Meridian vehicles, moving with the deliberate purpose of people who know where they are going and what they are going there for. They came down the access road and parked at the near end of the lot, and 4 people got out, 3 in plain clothes and 1 in a uniform that was not a county uniform. They came through the door. The conversation that followed was long and careful, and took place in sections, different people speaking to different investigators in different parts of the diner, while Dot refilled coffee cups with the equanimity of a woman who has hosted unusual events before and has long since decided that her function is to provide coffee and to stay out of the way of whatever else needs to happen. Hank spoke for 40 minutes. He gave the investigators Owen's documents and the USB drive and Ruth's contact information and his own account of the night's events from the moment Ruth sat down beside him. He was precise and complete, and he did not editorialize. Ruth spoke longer. She had been carrying the full version of the story for months, and she delivered it with Owen's precision and her own steadiness. And Hank watched from across the room as the investigators listened with the quality of attention that told him they understood what they were hearing and were going to do something with it. He texted Ray Corbin 2 words: "Check your email." Ruth had sent the full document file to 3 addresses before she left Tonopah. Ray was one of them. Owen had been thorough about that too. Fletcher Gann was placed in federal investigative custody at 5:12 in the morning, in the parking lot of the Desert Hawk Diner. He walked to the vehicle without resistance and without speaking, with the contained composure of a man who has been prepared for this possibility and has already begun calculating what the next moves look like from inside it. Crutchfield took longer. There were phone calls. There was a conversation with a lawyer who appeared on Crutchfield's phone screen from somewhere that was not Nevada. There was a 20-minute period during which the outcome appeared to require some negotiation to resolve. Hank was not party to any of that, and did not need to be. He sat in the corner booth and drank his 4th cup of coffee and watched the light change in the windows. At 5:47, Boyd Crutchfield, Nevada State Senator, chairman of the Natural Resources and Public Lands Committee, walked out of the Desert Hawk Diner and got into a federal vehicle. Voss had not gone far. His cruiser was found parked at a rest stop on Highway 95, with the engine running and the keys in the ignition. He was sitting in the passenger seat making calls when the state police arrived 40 minutes later. He did not resist. He understood, apparently, that a county sheriff who had spent 16 years accumulating the particular kind of debt that Voss had accumulated was not going to improve his position by running from it. The sky outside was the color of a Nevada desert. Pre-dawn, a dark blue that was not night and was not yet morning, but was something between the two. A suspension of the dark in which the shapes of things were beginning to be visible without their colors. The clouds from the storm had broken apart, and the stars to the west were still bright, above the highway where the weather had cleared first. Hank walked outside. The parking lot was different than it had been. The Meridian SUVs were gone. The federal vehicles were repositioning. The Hells Angels motorcycles sat in their formation along the far end of the lot, chrome dull in the pre-dawn damp from the rain that had stopped 2 hours ago. Bison came out and stood beside him. He said, "Fenwick wants a statement." Hank said Fenwick can write his story. He does not need a statement from me. Bison said, "Fair enough." They stood for a moment without speaking. The highway beyond the access road was empty in both directions, a pale stripe in the dark. Bison said, "Deke." Hank said, "Yeah." Bison said, "You gonna tell the chapter tonight?" Hank said, "In Reno. In the room, when we are all together. That is where that conversation belongs." Bison said, "Yeah." They were quiet again. The door of the diner opened and Ruth came out. She was wearing her wool coat dried now and carrying the canvas bag with both hands. Without the rain and the terror and the full weight of the night. On her face, she looked older and also lighter, as if the 3 days of running had added something to her visible age, and the end of the running had not yet fully arrived at the face to remove it. She stopped beside Hank and looked at the highway. She said, "What happens to the documents now?" He said, "The investigators take the originals. You keep copies. Fenwick has copies. The OIG intake record exists in a federal system. There are enough parallel records now that none of them can be managed away without leaving a larger mark than the original record." She said Owen spent 6 months trying to put it in front of someone who could use it. Hank said Owen built the case correctly. He just did not have the right door. She looked at the highway for a long time. She said he would have wanted to know that his work mattered. Not the result. The work itself. Hank thought about the spreadsheets, 14 pages of cross-reference transaction records, annotated in small, precise handwriting built by a man who knew he was building something that might outlast him, and who built it anyway with the care of a person who believed that the quality of the work was not contingent on whether he would be there to see what it produced. He said it mattered. She nodded once, a small movement. The nod of a person confirming something they needed to hear confirmed. She looked at the motorcycles lined up along the far end of the lot. She said, "Are you going to Reno now?" He said, "Yes." She said, "For your friend?" He said, "For Deke." "Yeah." She was quiet. Then she said, "What will you tell them?" He thought about the answer. He thought about the 11 years he had known Deke Pruitt the way Deke told a story badly, but laughed at it harder than anyone else in the room the way Deke rode, which was with a precision that was also somehow joyful. The two things coexisting in a way that was distinctive to him. He thought about the last time he had seen Deke 3 weeks ago. The argument about the Sierra Nevada route and the laughter afterward in the parking lot. He thought about October, about a job site in Winnemucca, about a concrete delivery about a man who noticed a discrepancy and mentioned it to a foreman and had no reason to think the mentioning was going to cost him anything. He said, "I will tell them that Deke saw something wrong." And he said so. The way Deke always said things, without making a big deal of it, just because it was the thing that needed to be said. Ruth looked at him. He said, "And I will tell them that the saying of it mattered, even though he did not live to see how." She was quiet. Then she reached into her canvas bag one more time. She brought out something small and handed it to him. It was a photograph, 4x6, slightly bent at one corner. The kind of photograph that has been carried in a bag for a while without the protection of a frame. It was a photograph of a man and a woman at what appeared to be a charity event, standing at a table. The man was in his 60s, trim and precise looking, with the expression of a person who is genuinely interested in the conversation he is having. The woman was Ruth younger in the photograph by several years, standing beside him with her hand on his arm. Standing across the table from them, listening to whatever Owen was saying with the attentiveness of someone who found the conversation worth listening to, was a face Hank recognized. Bison beside him recognized it at the same moment and made a sound that was not quite anything, but was in the direction of a laugh. It was Deke. Deke Pruitt at the 2018 Hells Angels charity event, talking to Owen and Ruth Calder in the photograph that a man had kept for 6 years because the conversation had been worth keeping. Hank looked at the photograph for a long time. He said they met. Ruth said. Owen talked about him for a week afterward. He said the young man with the socket wrench tattoo asked better questions about the audit work than anyone he had met in 30 years of practice. He said he had the kind of mind that understood systems without needing everything explained. He said he was going to be someone worth watching. Hank said nothing. She said, "When I saw Deke's name on the list, I thought you should have this." Hank held the photograph. He thought about Owen Calder leaving a note in the back of a closet that said to find the Hells Angels because they understood loyalty. He thought about the origin of that trust, which was a conversation at a charity table in 2018, which was Deke Pruitt asking good questions about audit work, which was a man deciding that the character he had seen in that conversation was the character of an organization worth trusting, when the alternative was trusting no one. He put the photograph in the inside pocket of his vest. He said to Ruth, "What will you do now?" She said, "I have a daughter in Portland. I have been afraid to contact her because I did not want to involve her. I think I am going to call her this morning." He said, "That is a good first call to make." She said, "And then I am going to sleep for approximately 1 week." Bison laughed. A real one this time, low and genuine, the laugh of a large man who has been holding himself carefully for several hours and has found a moment where it is not necessary. Ruth held out her hand to Hank. He shook it. Her grip was firm, the grip of a woman who had walked along a Nevada highway in the rain at 74 years old to keep faith with something her husband had trusted. She said, "Tell them about Owen, too. If you are going to tell them about Deke, tell them about Owen." He said, "I will." She went back inside to wait for the federal agents to arrange transportation to Reno, where she would be formally interviewed, and where her daughter, once called, was going to drive 14 hours in order to be the first person to see her mother's face in 3 days. Hank stood in the parking lot. The sky had shifted. Not dawn yet, not fully, but the east had changed from dark blue to a pale gray that was going to become something warmer in the next 30 minutes. The light arriving over the Nevada desert in the gradual way of a thing that does not hurry, because it does not need to, because it will arrive regardless of whether anyone is waiting for it. The Hells Angels members had come out and were moving to their bikes in the quiet, efficient way of men preparing to ride, checking fuel and adjusting gear. The small, familiar rituals of departure that were different in quality from arrival, more settled, more complete. Hank walked to his motorcycle. He ran his hand along the tank the way he always did before a long ride, a habit with no functional purpose that he had never been able to stop, and had long since stopped trying to stop. The chrome was damp from the rain and cold under his palm, and the bike sat solid and specific in the pale pre-dawn waiting. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest. He took out the envelope Ruth had given him. He turned it over. He opened it. The letter inside was 2 pages handwritten in the same small, precise handwriting he had been reading all night. It was dated 6 months ago, the week after Owen Calder had submitted his final organized version of the audit evidence. He read it. It was not a long letter. Owen was not the kind of man, apparently, who made things longer than they needed to be. He wrote about what he had found and why it mattered. Not the financial specifics, those were in the documents, but the human specifics, the 9 names, the understanding that they had not been abstract and were not abstract. Now that each name was a person who had seen something true and said so and been removed from the world for the saying of it. He wrote that he did not know who would read the letter or whether it would ever be read, but that he wanted the record to include the fact that the work he had done was done in the belief that the truth, when fully documented and placed in the hands of the right people, was not retrievable by the people who wanted to bury it. He wrote, "I have trusted you with this because I believe you are the right people, not because you are perfect, but because I have watched you be the same at the end of the day, as you were at the beginning when the work was unglamorous and no one was watching. And I have found in my experience that this quality, which sounds ordinary, is in fact quite rare and quite difficult, and that the organizations and individuals who possess it reliably are the ones worth trusting with difficult things." He wrote a final paragraph. He wrote, "If my wife has found you and you have helped her, please accept what is in the separate envelope as a contribution to whatever work you do that is worth doing. If you have not helped her, then this letter was not meant for you, and you should disregard it." He wrote at the bottom in letters slightly larger than the rest, "Thank you for stopping." Hank refolded the letter. He put it back in the inside pocket of his vest. He thought about Owen Calder writing that final line 6 months ago in a house in Flagstaff alone, after filing evidence that he did not know would find its way through the night to a man on a motorcycle outside a diner on Highway 50. "Thank you for stopping." He put on his gloves. Bison pulled his bike alongside and said, "Ready." Hank said, "Yeah." He started the engine. Around him, 22 other engines started in the sequence that the Hells Angels had maintained for 11 years. Each one in turn, oldest member to newest. A sequence that was not a rule, but had become a ritual. The way things that are done. The same way enough times stop being choices and become something else. Become the expression of what an organization actually believes about itself when no one is watching to evaluate it. The sound built from single to multiple, to the full combined roar of 23 V-twin engines in the pre-dawn air of the Nevada desert. A sound that carried out across the highway and into the flat, empty country beyond, and up into the fading dark of the sky. Hank sat in it for a moment before he moved. He sat in the sound of his brothers around him, and he looked at the highway ahead, pale and straight, and extending northward into the distance, where the sky was beginning finally to show what color it intended to be. This morning, which was the gold and rose of a desert, dawn after rain, the sky washed clean and wide and lit from below by a sun that was not yet visible but was already changing everything it was about to touch. 200 miles to Reno, a room full of Hell's Angels members waiting to say a name, a photograph in the inside pocket of his vest, and a letter and a memorial card that had been there for 10 days, and a list of 9 names that were going to be read into a federal record before the week was done. He put the bike in gear. He pulled out of the parking lot of the Desert Hawk Diner and onto the access road and turned north onto Highway 50, and behind him, the Hells Angels fell into formation, one by one, the way they always did, the way they had been doing for 11 years, the way they were going to keep doing long after tonight. Became a story that some of them would tell and others would carry quietly for the rest of their lives. The diner shrank in his mirrors and disappeared. The highway opened ahead, long and empty and clean after the rain, the painted lines white and clear. The desert on both sides enormous and still and indifferent to the particular humans crossing it, which was appropriate because the desert had been here for longer than any of them, and would be here longer still, and the crossing of it by people with things to carry was nothing new. Hank twisted the throttle, and the Harley moved forward into the morning. Behind him, 22 engines answered. The sun came up over the eastern mountains, and the light moved across the desert floor, the way light moves across open country at dawn, fast and horizontal and unimpeded, filling the world from east to west, and the motorcycles rode north through it. Chrome catching the first gold of the morning, the sound of them moving through the clean air of the Nevada desert like something that intended to stay.